I think, like many people, I find it extraordinary and inspiring, and unlike anything else somehow that we've seen in the Middle East. I think, historically, women in Iran and in other places have always been in the middle and at the front lines of different revolutions and different uprisings. But it's a different thing to see a movement that is mobilizing masses, that is begun by women and about women and about women's bodies, and then becoming about other things as well. But to have that, the instigation of it come and then be maintained by women themselves is really, it's extraordinary. I feel very moved and very I have a lot of respect. I have a lot of respect for what people are doing. It's called Radius, a story of feminist revolution, and it is about a group, a militant feminist group that was fighting against mob sexual assault against women, against female protesters in Tahrir. And so a couple of years into the Egyptian Revolution of 2011, there was a really horrific pattern of violence against female protesters that we began to see in Tahrir Square, which was kind of the iconic like heart of the movement. And in response to the violence, a few groups of people just organized themselves into these sort of like intervention squads and would go in and fight their way through very large and chaotic crowds, oftentimes facing very high levels of violence, to pull women out of these attacks. And the thing that was also very important about so the book is Radius is an account of this group. I was one of the organizers and volunteers in this group, which was called Operation Anti-Sexual Harassment and Assault. We called it Opantish for short. And one of the very important things about Opantish was that it was interested in sort of separating women out into separate spaces, or having, women only protests or women only rallies. Or the response was never about trying to attain safety by segregating them out. The fight was segregating women away from whatever else was happening on the street. The mission really was to fight for and insist on women's rights to be full participants in the political and revolutionary work of the time. And that meant, the freedom and ability to be wherever they wanted and needed to be. And that included Tahrir Square, of course. And yeah, the group was led by women. There were definitely, men were involved and very involved, but women were really the ones shaping its politics and making the decisions. And it grew from being a sort of, a group of people on the ground sort of trying to figure out what to do, to a sort of a much more sophisticated operation with hundreds of volunteers and a network of, there was a control room and getaway cars and, of course, intervention teams on the ground that were doing the sort of the core of the work of fighting to basically save women from these horrible attacks. And over time, it was quite effective because, the violence decreased. Like there were fewer attacks over time, and the group became more adept at doing the work safely, and at lowering the risk of volunteers being attacked themselves in the course of the work. So it's a example of direct feminist action and intervention by women in the face of a violence that, often women's experience of sexual violence is one that leaves us sort of paralyzed and unsure unsure what to do, unable to really fight back, even if we might want to. And this was a sort of an example of women being able to be agents, basically. There are similarities, and I think that we've seen this kind of violence against women's bodies, this sexual violence against women's bodies, is always a part of mass conflict and war. There were horrific rapes during the partition of India in the middle of the last century. It's um, in every sustained political conflict, this becomes an issue, and it is a way of terrorizing women. And as you say, sending a message that it is not safe for women to participate. And I imagine that with what's happening in Iran, this cuts to the very heart of of what women are fighting for. And I don't know if there are solutions. I don't know if there are solutions, but the reason that I wrote the book was that at the time that we were organizing this group in Egypt, we realized that we were sort of doing something that we didn't have a blueprint or a map for. And I remember we looked online and tried to find examples that we could learn from of how to sort of organize ourselves to do this work, and we didn't really find much. And it's not to say that the way that we did things in Cairo can be replicated exactly the same way in Iran or anywhere else, but I do think that trying to share um, our accounts and our details and what we've learned from these experiences, as sort of messy and traumatizing as they may have been, is extremely important. And it's also extremely difficult to put out these stories once things have calmed down. And in Egypt, I mean, the revolution ended very badly. It ended with a military coup that has led to a lot of oppression and censorship and so on. And so these histories do get erased. Not only are they difficult to tell because of trauma and so on, but they also are actively and intentionally being erased. So the book is a sort of an attempt to provide a useful history in that sense. And I mean, given the sort of what we've seen from Iran in terms of the sort of the brilliant, creative resourcefulness of people who are doing this incredibly brave work, I'm sure that people will find their ways of fighting back and resisting. And I say that without putting a sort of pressure of like they must sort of be heroes and try to win. Like, no, this isn't about being heroic. It's certainly very brave, but we are all just people, and this is very, very difficult work. I think one of the things that I was thinking a lot about and hearing from people who I interviewed for the book about Opantish, it was very much about this. And I think that, I mean, I do think that patriarchy is one form of social control, and it is about social and biological and economic control of women and their bodies. And so when things break down, when there is conflict, it's not surprising that it often gets played out on women's bodies in a way that different political forces also try to use for political gain, right? So you see women becoming the sort of like, not only is there violence against their bodies directly by security forces or others, but you also see women's bodies sort of becoming symbols of the nation or symbols of religious, piety or symbols of morality. And these are all um, constructs and ways of imagining the world that are ultimately harmful for women because they put them in a prescribed box and prescribed role that is very, very difficult to break out of. And that's one of the things that we're seeing happen in Iran, or one of the ways that I understand it. And then it's connected to the fact that it's not just in these moments of conflict or upheaval that you see this violence, right? Sexual violence is like incredibly universal and almost, it's almost banal. It's almost day to day. Like we treat it as a really exceptional, horrific, one of the worst sort of things that human beings do, and we sort of don't know how to deal with it, and we exceptionalize it. And I think that we hurt our chances um, of really dealing with and preventing it when we do that, because it's actually extremely connected to the rest of life and to the rest of, the forces of uh, of capitalism and government and family structure and all of the kind of the social structures that keep us from being able to feel free. And it seems to sort of be a constant underpinning of all of them. I think that can be one of the hardest things to deal with, is the kind of, when you lose those first sort of outpourings of energy, and it becomes a bit rote and a bit repetitive, and you sort of feel that, and people start to question, like, well, why are we doing this again? And as you say, they want to get on with things. But I think I would I think people can find other ways, other spaces, other ways of demonstrating, of taking the fight to different parts of life. I think especially when with the sort of, with women's freedom being at the center of this, it's a very multifaceted battle. So we'll see. I don't have any answers, but I have a sense that we'll see it sort of reshape. In Egypt, there was a particular power structure in place, to do with, the role of the military and so on, that meant that this leaderless revolution was up against very, very real and very powerful, sort of, deep and entrenched, forces that were ready to step in and take control. And so that's where the question of, like, well, would leadership or formal organization at the top of a movement be a more, give you better chances, basically, of not ultimately being completely quashed as a revolution. But again, history also, if you look at different Russian revolutions, I mean, I don't know, there doesn't seem to be a particular model of revolution that works in general. But what I can feel confident in saying is that whatever happens with an experience and a phenomenon like what is happening in Iran now every day, there's no going back. This will change society. What that looks like, and through, what it looks like in terms of formal political change, we'll have to see. But it's happened.